You don't belong in this seat. Sir, coach is in the back. Those were the exact words the flight attendant said as she stood over him, her arms crossed, her eyes cold, and her voice carrying enough weight to silence an entire cabin. And just like that, everything stopped. Before we dive into what happened next, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if stories about justice and standing your ground matter to you, like this video and hit subscribe. It helps more people see what really matters. Now, let me tell you what happened on Turkish Airlines flight TK-213. The plane was sitting at JFK Airport in New York, set to depart for Istanbul. First-class passengers were still settling in, placing bags in the overhead bins, sipping complimentary water, scrolling through emails. Everything looked smooth, at least on the surface. Julian Wright, a tall, well-dressed black man in his mid-40s, quietly stepped into the first-class cabin. He wasn't flashy, just intentional. Navy wool suit, clean white shirt, polished shoes, and a weathered leather briefcase that had clearly seen 1,000 miles. Nothing about him screamed celebrity or billionaire, but everything about him said he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, without saying a word. He walked to seat 2A, placed his bag gently under the seat, and sat down with a quiet kind of grace. He looked around, nodded politely at the flight crew, and opened a folded printout, notes for a corporate operations audit. No one around him knew this yet, but Julian was more than just a passenger. He was the chief operating officer of Turkish Airlines in North America. And this wasn't just a flight. It was a quiet investigation. After weeks of hearing about possible discrimination against passengers of color, especially in premium cabins, he'd decided to board this flight undercover. No announcement, no special badge, just him, the seat, and the truth. But the moment he got comfortable, a shadow fell over his shoulder. Emma Rhodes, the lead purser, stood in front of him with a clipboard in hand. Her hair was perfectly styled, her uniform sharp, but her expression told a different story. She looked Julian up and down, then did it again, slower this time. Her voice was calm, but something behind it was colder than the air conditioning. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," she said, like it was some kind of test. Julian didn't flinch. He handed it over without hesitation. She stared at it longer than necessary, then narrowed her eyes. That's strange. This seat was reassigned this morning. There must be some kind of mix-up." Julian kept his tone even, polite. "I double-checked at the gate. The ticket scanned just fine." But Emma wasn't convinced. She gestured toward the back of the plane. "Until we sort this out, I'll need you to wait in economy." Just like that. No apology, no explanation. Just a decision. Made on the spot. Julian looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Why? What's wrong with the boarding pass?" She hesitated, then said it. "You don't look like you belong in this seat. Sir, coach is in the back." Her words cut through the air like a slap. He paused, not out of shock, but out of choice. He'd heard those words before, not in those exact terms, but in the tone, in the assumptions, in the looks people gave him his whole life. But before we get there, before he became a COO, before the suit and the leather bag, there was a 15-year-old boy in New Orleans, standing outside a classroom in a torn hoodie, shivering from the cold, because his teacher had kicked him out for not following the dress code, not because he misbehaved, but because he didn't look like he belonged. Julian never forgot that day. That same feeling rushed back in now, as he sat there, grown, accomplished, respected, and still being told he wasn't enough. Passengers nearby turned to watch. Some whispered, some avoided eye contact, but one woman, Lauren White, seated next to Julian, looked up sharply. She didn't say anything yet, but her face said everything. Emma turned to the young male flight attendant standing behind her. Chase, can you escort this gentleman to the back until we verify? Chase, maybe mid-30s, puffed his chest a little. No problem. He reached down toward Julian's bag without asking. Julian stopped him with a single, calm sentence. I'll carry my own bag. Chase blinked, confused. Look, man, we're just doing our job. Don't make this into something it's not. Julian stood slowly. I'm not, but you already did. As Julian stepped into the aisle, the cabin grew quiet. First-class passengers, sipping their sparkling water, suddenly remembered how to stay silent when things got uncomfortable. Lauren spoke up, barely above a whisper, but firm. He was here before any of us boarded. I saw it. Emma didn't acknowledge her. She just motioned toward the curtain. Julian walked through it, not defeated, but taking mental notes, every detail, every word. This wasn't new to him. It was just the latest version of the same story. The story he had spent years trying to rewrite. And what Emma didn't know, what Chase didn't even imagine, was that the man they just removed from 2A was the second highest-ranking executive in the airline's entire North American division, and they had just handed him exactly what he came for. Proof. What happens next? Oh, you'll want to see it, because in less than 15 minutes, this crew will face a truth they weren't prepared for. And this flight? It won't take off until justice does. Julian stood just past the curtain separating first class from economy, gripping the worn leather strap of his briefcase with one hand and steadying himself on the seat back with the other. The walk wasn't long, but the message had been loud and clear. It wasn't about the seat. It was about being seen. And now, as he stood in the narrow aisle of coach, surrounded by the low buzz of conversations, blinking screens, and the faint smell of reheated meals, the memories started rushing back again, this time from when he was 20, applying for a summer internship at a major airline. He had everything: top grades, perfect attendance, letters of recommendation, and yet, the interviewer, a man in a crisp gray suit, leaned back in his chair and said, "You're smart, but you don't quite have the look we're going for." Julian remembered staring at his own reflection in the elevator mirror after that interview, wondering what the look meant. Now, 2 decades later, here he was, still being told he didn't have the look. As he eased into an empty seat in economy, his body remained still, but his mind was already moving. He glanced down at his phone, not to check messages, but to recall something else entirely. This wasn't the first time he'd been pushed back, but if he had anything to say about it, it would be the last time it happened on his watch. Meanwhile, back in first class, Brandon Foster, a red-faced, loud-talking businessman with an overstuffed briefcase and an oversized ego, came strutting down the aisle. "There he is," he said, pointing at Julian's now empty seat like he'd just won a raffle. "Told y'all someone was squatting." Emma smiled like the truth had been revealed. "We've taken care of it," she said smoothly. Brandon dropped into 2A with a huff, grinning wide and already ordering a whiskey. "People think they can just sit wherever now. Unreal." His voice wasn't hushed. He didn't care who heard. The people around him did hear, and many turned away in quiet discomfort. But not all of them. Lauren White, still seated in 2B, crossed her arms and stared out the window, jaw clenched. And Olivia Chen, the senior flight attendant on duty, mid-30s, calm under pressure, watched everything unfold from the service station with a sinking feeling in her chest. She'd seen that man, Julian, board early. She'd seen his name on the manifest. Something didn't add up. Olivia tapped her screen again, scrolled, and found it. Seat 2A, right. Julian. Ticket class, confirmed. Status, internal VIP code. She looked again. Still there, still correct. She printed a second copy and walked quietly to Emma. "Emma," she said, keeping her voice low, "I rechecked the manifest. Seat 2A is his. There's no reassignment, no error." Emma didn't look up. "It's too late. He already moved." "But it was his seat," Olivia replied, her voice firmer. "It still is." Emma's tone sharpened. "Look, we have a full cabin and we're already behind. We'll deal with this after takeoff. I don't need this turning into a thing." "It already is a thing," Olivia said under her breath. Chase Hamilton, standing nearby and pretending not to listen, smirked and chimed in. "You know how they get, always making something simple into a whole scene." Olivia stared at him for a beat too long. "Who exactly is they?" "Chase." He shrugged. "You know what I mean?" But she did know. She knew exactly what he meant. And she knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about who got believed, who got challenged, and who got erased. Back in business class, Dev Patel, a tech executive heading to a conference in Istanbul, had seen enough. He'd been quietly filming bits of the interaction from his aisle seat, trying not to draw attention, not to stir drama, but to document the truth. He opened a private chat with his assistant and typed, "Need internal PR contact for Turkish. Possible incident on flight. High-level exec involved." The assistant replied instantly. "What kind of incident?" Dev sent a frame from the footage, Julian being escorted out of first class while remaining completely composed. "Discrimination, bad optics, and I think the guy's someone important." Meanwhile, Julian sat motionless in economy, watching a family of 4 struggle to get their carry-ons settled. The father looked tired, the mother embarrassed, the kids restless. He smiled gently as the youngest dropped her toy under his seat. He picked it up and handed it to her. She grinned. "Thanks, mister." He nodded, but his eyes returned to the front of the plane. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but inside. Something had shifted. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about responsibility. He thought of his mother again, how she used to say, "People may not treat you right. That's their burden. How you carry yourself, that's yours." And he intended to carry himself with dignity, but also with consequences. Lauren finally turned to Emma. "That man didn't do anything wrong. You know that, right?" Emma dismissed her. "You're not involved." "Actually," Lauren said, standing, "I was sitting right next to him, and I think I am involved." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, please sit down. You just removed a paying passenger who was sitting in the right seat without verifying anything. I saw his boarding pass. He showed you. Twice." "Please," Emma said, her voice cracking just a little. "This isn't your concern." "It is now," Lauren answered. "Because you didn't just treat him like he didn't belong. You treated all of us like we couldn't see what you were doing." Olivia had heard enough. She picked up the printed manifest and walked to the cockpit. She tapped gently on the door, and when the captain opened it, she handed him the list. "We have a problem," she said quietly. "And I think you're going to want to see it before we leave the ground." And just like that, the curtain between justice and silence started to lift. Julian didn't know it yet, but the pieces were shifting. The quiet allies were stepping forward, and Turkish Airlines Flight TK-213 wasn't going anywhere. Not until the people in power realized they'd tried to remove the wrong man from the right seat. Julian didn't hear the words at first, not clearly, but the sharp laughter that followed told him everything he needed to know. "Stop acting like you're somebody," the man said. Loud enough for row 9 to hear, Brandon Foster, the self-declared owner of seat 2A, had stepped away from his seat and was now strolling down the aisle toward the economy section, whiskey in hand, clearly enjoying his 5 minutes of misplaced power. He stopped at Julian's row, leaned slightly forward, and said it again, this time with a smug grin. Some folks just can't accept their place, huh? The few people nearby fell silent. Julian didn't respond. He didn't blink. He just looked up, slow and measured, and said in a calm, steady voice, "You might want to walk away." Brandon scoffed. "Is that a threat?" "No," Julian replied. "It's advice." The moment hung in the air like a dropped plate. Tense, quiet, sharp. A flight attendant appeared and quickly pulled Brandon away, whispering something about how the captain had been informed and that he needed to sit down. Brandon rolled his eyes and returned to 2A, muttering all the way about sensitive people and reverse racism. But what Brandon, Emma, and Chase didn't realize was that the story was no longer theirs to control, because back in the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes was staring at a flight manifest with Julian Wright's name printed clearly on seat 2A, and beside it, a red highlighted internal security code reserved for top-level corporate officers. The captain was not a political man. He wasn't dramatic, but he was a rule follower. And this was a violation. He looked at Olivia Chin, who stood in front of him with her hands clasped tightly. "How long has he been in economy?" he asked. 10 minutes, she answered. "And from what I've seen, he never once raised his voice." Hayes nodded slowly, already picturing the headlines, the board calls, and the ripple effects. "Okay," he said. "I'll handle it." Meanwhile, back in coach, Julian stared ahead, not blinking, not moving. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. His thoughts drifted back to another time, another moment, when he was 20 years old. He'd applied for an elite internship with a national airline, one he dreamed of working for since he was a boy. He showed up in his only suit, pressed the night before with a borrowed iron, shoes polished with hand soap and hope. He had a 3.9 GPA from Howard, letters of recommendation from professors who believed in him, and a deep, working knowledge of airport systems from his part-time baggage handler job. The interview seemed to go well, until the end. The recruiter, a white man in his late 50s with a tight smile and tired eyes, said, "You're sharp, son, but honestly, we're looking for someone with a more polished image." That word, image, had echoed in his mind ever since. And here he was again, 2 decades later, being asked to leave a seat he had every right to occupy because his image didn't match the expectations of a biased crew. But he didn't let those memories crush him. He let them sharpen him, just as he was about to stand and speak with Olivia, who had returned quietly and offered him a bottle of water with trembling hands. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be delaying pushback for a few more moments as we work through a seating clarification in first class. Thank you for your patience." It was subtle, professional, but Julian caught the tone. The captain wasn't brushing this off. He was stepping in, moments later. The curtain separating first class from economy parted, and Captain Hayes himself walked through, calm but firm, with the printed manifest in hand. His face was unreadable, but his direction was clear. He approached Julian, extended his hand, and said, "Mr. Wright, I believe we've made a serious mistake. If you'll follow me." "Sir." Julian didn't stand quickly. He rose with dignity, with the kind of poise that makes people rethink everything they assumed about you. The cabin was watching now, everyone, from rows 5 to 50. Phones weren't up yet, but eyes were. He followed the captain through the cabin, the same path he'd walked just 15 minutes ago. But this time, no curtain of shame, no unspoken judgment, just truth walking back to where it belonged. as they reached seat 2A. Julian didn't even glance at Brandon, who suddenly found himself shrinking in his seat, the whiskey forgotten. Emma was already standing there, her hands folded, her face pale. Chase appeared beside her, looking suddenly very small. "We're terribly sorry, Mr. Wright," Emma said, her voice thin and insincere. "There must have been a system glitch." Julian looked at her for a long moment, then down at the seat, then back at her. "It wasn't a glitch," he said quietly. "It was a decision." Her eyes darted. "We had to act quickly, and you weren't responding clearly to our questions." "I responded clearly," Julian cut in. "Twice." Chase tried to add something, but the captain held up his hand. "That's enough," Hayes said. "Mr. Wright, I'll speak with you privately in the galley." Julian nodded and turned away, following the captain, and though he didn't say anything to Brandon, the businessman sat frozen, jaw clenched, shoulders tight. He knew. He wouldn't admit it. But he knew he had just embarrassed himself, publicly, permanently, and upstairs, in a corporate office far from that airplane. Someone had just received a message from Dev Patel with the subject line, "Urgent, CEO-level incident in progress." Because what started as humiliation was quickly becoming something far bigger. Julian wasn't just returning to his seat, he was returning to the truth. And when he sat down again in 2A, he wasn't just reclaiming a spot. He was reclaiming every moment in his life where someone had tried to make him smaller than he was. And now the reckoning had begun. Julian followed Captain Hayes into the narrow galley at the front of the aircraft, the hum of refrigeration units and overhead lights buzzing softly in the quiet. The captain closed the curtain behind them and exhaled hard, not just from frustration, but the weight of what he now understood. "Sir," Hayes said, lowering his voice, "I don't know what to say. This never should have happened." Julian studied him, not with anger, but with the practiced calm of a man who had been here before. Different setting, same insult. "I didn't expect an apology," he said softly. "I came here to observe. What I didn't expect was to become the example." Captain Hayes nodded. "I've flown 12,000 hours. I've seen all kinds of passengers. What I witnessed back there wasn't protocol. It was profiling." Julian didn't respond right away. He reached into his inner coat pocket and retrieved a plain white envelope marked only with the company's internal seal. He handed it to the captain. "That contains my credentials, along with an operations audit memo you were scheduled to receive in Istanbul. It was supposed to be a routine inspection." Hayes opened the envelope, scanned the contents, and blinked. "Julian Wright, Chief Operating Officer, Turkish Airlines, North America." His breath caught. "My God." "No need to make a scene," Julian said. "I'm not here for theatrics. I'm here for accountability." At that very moment, just beyond the curtain, Lauren White stood up again in first class, holding her phone tightly in her hand. She wasn't filming, but she was ready. Brandon Foster, still sitting in Julian's seat, shifted uncomfortably. He had taken off his jacket and tried to shrink into the chair, but guilt doesn't fade just because you're uncomfortable. Olivia Chen returned to the cabin and leaned in to Emma, who was standing stiff by the galley door. "The captain knows," Olivia whispered. "He's with Mr. Right now." Emma's expression didn't move, but her neck flushed red. "We followed procedure," she muttered. "We followed instinct," Chase added behind her. "He looked." "Don't," Olivia interrupted. "You judge the man, not the manifest," Chase scoffed. "You act like he's a king or something." Olivia turned to him, her voice low but deliberate. "He's the second highest-ranking officer in our region. He doesn't need to act like a king, because he already commands the respect you just lost in business class." Dev Patel was still in quiet motion. He wasn't trying to go viral. He wasn't uploading footage to the public. He was gathering facts, names, timestamps. He had already spoken to 2 witnesses in first class, Lauren and a retired veteran named Noah Delgado, who both confirmed that Julian had boarded early, without issue, and had been sitting in seat 2A with valid documentation before Brandon Foster even boarded. Noah had kept quiet at first, but now, leaning forward from his aisle seat, he calmly told a nearby attendant, "If you need a statement, I'll give it. That man was treated unfairly, and I've fought wars to protect people from exactly this kind of injustice." Back in the galley, Julian and Captain Hayes stood eye to eye. Hayes said, "What would you like me to do, sir?" Julian glanced toward the curtain, then back at the captain. "I'd like you to let me handle it, but I need your support when the time comes." The captain nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely." Julian then said something simple, but with gravity. "Don't let them turn this into an accident. It was a choice. They knew what they were doing." Hayes gave a tight nod. "Understood." With that, Julian stepped back through the curtain, returning to the cabin. The moment his face appeared, the atmosphere changed again. Some passengers looked away out of shame. Others leaned in, realizing they were watching something significant unfold. He walked down the aisle, calm, collected, and returned to his seat. 2A. Brandon, still in the seat, scrambled to stand up. "Sorry, I didn't know," he started. "You didn't care," Julian replied quietly. "That's worse." Brandon stepped aside as Julian took his place. Without apology, without hesitation, Lauren gave him a small nod of support. He returned it. Then, with the whole cabin watching, Julian turned toward Emma and Chase, who stood by the service station, visibly tense. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "This was never about a boarding pass," he said. "It was about a decision you made the moment you looked at me." Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. Chase stared at the floor. "I didn't create this test," Julian continued. "But you failed it." His voice wasn't angry. It was clear, measured, earned. "I've spent 25 years building this company's trust, from the baggage claim to the boardroom, and today, you jeopardized all of it, because your bias spoke louder than your training." No one in first class moved. Even the passengers who had stayed silent earlier now sat frozen, confronted with the truth they couldn't ignore. Emma tried again. "I truly apologize if—" "Don't apologize for how I felt," Julian interrupted. "Apologize for what you did." Olivia, standing beside them, slowly stepped forward and said, "He's right." Her voice was steady now. "We can't fix what we won't admit." The captain reappeared at the front of the cabin, not to speak, but to show support. His presence said everything. Julian turned back in his seat, placed his bag gently by his feet, and exhaled. The moment had passed, but the impact remained. A flight that hadn't even left the ground had already exposed a truth many try to keep in the air. That dignity is not assigned by a seat number, a skin color, or a stitched-on uniform. It's lived, earned, and, when tested, proven. The next move? It wouldn't be quiet. The silence in the first-class cabin was so sharp you could hear the ice cubes settling in half-finished glasses. Brandon Foster had retreated to 3D, slouched low, pretending to scroll through emails that weren't loading. Chase stood stiff at the galley divider, arms folded but fingers twitching. Emma was pale, lips tight, eyes darting everywhere but toward the man now seated in 2A, Julian Wright, whose calm was starting to make the rest of them nervous. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't grandstanding, and that made it worse. It made it real. Olivia Chen stepped back into the cabin after speaking briefly with the captain. Her expression had shifted from uncertain to grounded. She looked at Julian, then addressed the passengers, not loudly, but with the kind of voice that cuts through chatter. "Everyone," she began, "for those of you who witnessed the earlier disruption, I need to clarify something. The man in seat 2A is Mr. Julian Wright, the Chief Operating Officer of Turkish Airlines, North America." A collective inhale filled the air, as if the entire cabin had forgotten to breathe until now. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just sat there, spine straight, expression steady, like a man used to carrying weight in rooms that didn't want him there. Emma took a step forward, voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Wright, I had no idea. If I had known." He cut her off with a quiet but final tone. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with dignity." The words hung there, simple but undeniable. Chase looked like he wanted to disappear. Lauren White, still seated in 2B, turned her head toward the other passengers. "He was calm the whole time," she said. "Polite, respectful. They were the ones who escalated it." Dev Patel, in business class, sent a final message from his phone. "Identity confirmed. Passenger is airline COO. Video and statements prepared if needed." He didn't want to make this go public, but he wanted the airline to know. Someone was watching. Captain Hayes emerged once again, his voice clear as he addressed the staff in front of the passengers. "Mr. Wright's seat was never reassigned. The error wasn't in the system. It was in judgment." Emma swallowed hard. "Sir, You removed an executive from his rightful seat." The captain continued. "You dismissed a verified boarding pass, and you publicly humiliated him without evidence." Julian finally looked up at Emma. "You asked for my pass twice. You looked at my face and decided it didn't match the seat. But here's the thing, Ms. Rhodes, I wasn't the one out of place." Olivia stepped in again, her voice steadier now, as she faced Emma and Chase directly. "I tried to correct it. I showed you the manifest. You told me not to interfere." Julian gave Olivia a respectful nod. "Thank you for speaking when it mattered." He then turned to Emma. "I've heard the stories. I've seen the reports. Discrimination complaints dismissed, covered, denied. That's why I boarded this flight quietly, not to catch you off guard, but to see the truth for myself. And now I have." Emma's face collapsed in on itself, her professional shell breaking. "It wasn't personal," she murmured. Julian shook his head gently. "It always is when someone loses their humanity in the name of efficiency." At that moment, Noah Delgado, the veteran who had been quiet all flight, stood from business class. He steadied himself, looked around, and said with authority, "I fought in 2 wars. One thing I know, you can't serve a country, or a company, by treating people like they're less than you. I saw what happened. That man didn't deserve it." Several heads nodded. A murmur passed through the cabin. Not outrage, not shock, but a slow, dawning awareness that something deeply wrong had taken place right in front of them. Captain Hayes turned toward Chase. "We'll speak with HR when we land. For now, consider yourself relieved of duties for this flight." Chase opened his mouth, then closed it. Emma looked at the captain. "And me?" "That decision's already been made," Julian replied before the captain could. "You're relieved, effective immediately." Olivia looked stunned, not at the decision, but at the speed and clarity of it. Emma said nothing. She just stood there, frozen, then slowly stepped back toward the curtain, shoulders dropped, eyes to the floor. Lauren leaned closer to Julian and whispered, "Thank you for standing up, quietly, but powerfully." Julian smiled slightly, more from humility than pride. Thank you for not staying silent. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Tina Morales, the gate supervisor, received a direct message from the captain. She read the message twice, then radioed the operations desk. I need standby replacements for 2 crew members. We're making staff changes before departure. Dev watched as the attendants moved through the cabin with subtle urgency, prepping the way for the final transition. Passengers were quiet, thoughtful. The air felt heavier, but also clearer. Something had shifted. Julian sat still, head slightly bowed, remembering the words his wife once wrote in a letter before they separated, words he never forgot. You're so busy proving your worth, you forget that you already have it. He thought about that often. And now, as the flight crew reset their positions and final calls were made, he realized this moment wasn't about vengeance. It was about value, about drawing a line in the sky and saying, no more. Captain Hayes came back to first class one final time. Mr. Wright, he said, we're ready for departure. And again, I'm sorry. Julian simply nodded. Just make sure this doesn't happen again, to anyone. And with that, the engines began to hum. The doors sealed. Turkish Airlines flight TK-213 was finally ready to take off. But something else had already taken flight. Truth, dignity, and the quiet kind of justice that doesn't need to be loud to land exactly where it should. The engines of Turkish Airlines flight TK-213 had just begun to hum as ground crews gave final clearance. But inside the cabin, time had slowed. The aircraft might have been preparing for departure, but something far more important was already underway. A reckoning. Julian Wright sat in seat 2A, quiet, thoughtful, his fingers laced in front of him as Captain Hayes returned to his side with 2 escort crew members in tow. The air around them was heavy, but not with panic. No. This was the weight of consequences finally arriving. Hayes looked down at Emma and Chase, both standing in awkward silence just feet from the galley. Mr. Wright, the captain said, we're ready to proceed. Do you still wish to take immediate action? Julian stood slowly, smoothing the front of his blazer. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked directly at both crew members, the ones who had judged him, removed him, and tried to bury it under procedure. Then, in a voice calm but unmistakably final, he said, yes, I do. He turned to Tina Morales, the gate supervisor who had just reboarded per protocol, and handed her a folded card from his wallet. Effective immediately, Emma Rhodes and Chase Hamilton are terminated from service. I've signed and authorized the report myself. There will be no appeal. Tina, a seasoned professional, said nothing. She just nodded, took the card, and gave a quiet gesture to the replacement attendants waiting near the front cabin door. Emma's mouth opened, but no sound came. Chase looked from the captain to Julian, panic creeping into his voice. Come on, man. I didn't even touch you. I was just following her lead. You followed her bias. Julian replied, not protocol. Chase stepped forward, voice rising now. You're gonna fire us because you felt disrespected? Julian blinked once. No, I'm firing you because you disrespected this uniform, this airline, and the dignity of every passenger who doesn't look like you. And then you lied to cover it. That line hit harder than any raised voice ever could. Emma looked at Julian, tears beginning to form. But he didn't soften. You judged me on what you saw, not who I am. And worse, you assumed no one would notice, that no one would care. He exhaled slowly, then continued, voice low, heavy. I didn't build this airline to be perfect, but I built it to be better than the world that tried to keep me out of it. And then, as if the weight of those words needed somewhere to land, Julian's mind flashed, back 10 years, to the moment everything in his personal life began to fall apart. He was 35, already climbing the executive ladder, flying to 5 cities a week, building routes, negotiating contracts. On the outside, he was winning, but at home, things were unraveling. His wife, Mariah, had left him a letter, folded neatly on the kitchen table next to his cold dinner. "Julian," it read, "I believe in what you're building, but I miss who you were before it all. You're fighting for a seat at someone else's table, but you've stopped showing up at ours." He remembered reading it over and over, alone in the quiet, remembered the pain, not of her leaving, but of realizing she was right. That, in his fight, to prove he belonged. He'd neglected the very people who already believed in him. That was the moment he promised himself. If he ever had real power, he'd use it not just to rise, but to protect, to correct. And now here he was, doing just that, not with rage, but with resolve. Back on the plane. As Emma and Chase gathered their things, escorted silently toward the jet bridge, a hush fell over the passengers. This wasn't drama anymore. It was justice. Olivia Chen stepped forward once more and placed her hand gently on Julian's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting this go." Julian nodded. "Thank you for speaking up. A lot of people wouldn't." "I've been silent before," she admitted. "I won't be again." Tina returned with the new crew members and confirmed that both Emma and Chase had left the aircraft. Captain Hayes turned to Julian. "We're ready for pushback." "One more thing," Julian said. He stood again, this time facing the cabin, not just first class, but the entire front half of the plane now quiet and listening. "I want everyone on this flight to hear this clearly," he began. "You don't need a title to deserve respect. You don't need wealth, or a fancy suit, or corporate authority to be treated with basic human decency." He paused, making eye contact with passengers across the aisle. "I sat in economy for 10 minutes and saw people kinder than the ones trained to serve. That should never be the case." His voice didn't waver. "This isn't about one seat. It's about how many people are pushed out of their place in the world simply because someone decided they didn't look the part." There was no applause, no cheering, just stillness, listening, learning, the kind of silence that means something finally landed. Julian returned to his seat, buckled in, and took one last look out the window. Not at the runway, but at his own reflection, faint against the glass. Not the man who once stood outside a classroom in a torn jacket. Not the college kid who was told he didn't have the image. Not even the executive who once lost his family to ambition, but a man who finally stopped asking for permission to belong and started changing the system that needed fixing. The engines roared to life. Turkish Airlines flight TK-213 began its slow roll down the taxiway. And somewhere in the sky that day, a different kind of course correction had already begun. The plane had climbed through the cloud layer now, gliding smooth and steady toward Istanbul. The cabin lights dimmed, the seatbelt signs blinked off, and the atmosphere settled into a hush, like the aircraft itself was catching its breath after everything that had unfolded. Julian Wright sat back in 2A, eyes closed for a long moment, not because he was tired, but because he was taking it all in. The last 90 minutes hadn't just changed the tone of a flight. They had revealed something deeper, something most people miss in a world that moves too fast. Across the aisle, Lauren White quietly reached over and placed a folded napkin on Julian's armrest. On it, she had written in neat cursive, "Thank you for carrying yourself the way you did. You gave a lot of us the courage to speak up next time." He read it, gave her a nod, and tucked the note inside his briefcase, right next to the memo he had brought on board at the start of the flight. That memo had been designed to address compliance, protocol, and passenger satisfaction metrics. But now, Now it was going to be rewritten, because this wasn't about numbers anymore. This was about people. As the new flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, resetting the service cart and trying to move past the tension, Olivia Chen lingered by Julian's seat. She didn't interrupt, just stood there until he looked up. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Been worse," he said, then added, "Been better too." She smiled at that. "I want you to know, not everyone on this crew agreed with what happened. A few of us have seen things before. We just didn't know how to speak without risking our own jobs." Julian looked at her with understanding, not pity. "You spoke up today," he said. "That matters more than you know." She looked down for a moment, then straightened. "Well, after this, I'll never be quiet again." She turned and walked away, leaving Julian alone again with his thoughts and the soft hum of the jet engines. He leaned his head back and stared at the overhead panel, eyes blinking slowly as another memory crept in. Quiet, but vivid. It was years ago, back when he was just getting started in the airline industry. A regional manager had told him during a performance review, "You're very competent, Julian, but you're not exactly what passengers expect to see in charge." He'd smiled politely, said nothing, and walked out with that line echoing in his chest. Not what they expect. Over time, he realized those words weren't meant as feedback. They were meant as a ceiling, a silent way of telling him, "Stay where we think you fit." But he never did. He kept showing up, kept earning it, kept climbing, even when people around him were too busy looking at his skin to see his skill. And now, here he was, not just in the seat, but in command. Not because he forced his way in, but because he refused to let others define his limits. He glanced again at the passengers in first class. Some still looked uneasy, others looked reflective, but a few, like Lauren, Noah, and Dev, looked steady, changed, maybe humbled, somewhere mid-cabin. A teenage girl leaned over to her father and whispered, "That's the guy from the front. He runs the airline." And the father whispered back, "Good, then maybe things will finally get better." That, right there, that small moment, was the reason Julian did what he did. Not for the title, not even for the justice, but for the ones who would fly tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, and not be pulled from their seat for looking like they didn't belong. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a notepad. He began to write a new policy draft right there in the sky. The Passenger Dignity Initiative, a training overhaul for every Turkish Airlines crew member in North America. It would include live bias response drills, real passenger stories, and a zero-tolerance clause for discriminatory conduct. He would introduce it next month, then fly city to city himself to lead the first sessions. It wouldn't be a memo. It would be a movement. As the flight attendants began the dinner service, Captain Hayes stepped out of the cockpit briefly, made his way to Julian's seat, and said, "Sir, when we land, I'll be speaking to corporate HR and the union reps personally. You have my full cooperation." Julian gave a firm nod. "Thank you, Captain, and I appreciate how you handled this." Hayes hesitated, then added, "To be honest, I wish I'd known who you were when you boarded." Julian gave him a look, patient, not bitter. "I wish it didn't matter who I was." And with that, the captain returned to the cockpit, and Julian returned to his notepad, writing as the plane glided through the night. The final hour of the flight was quiet. No more tension, no more posturing, just reflection. Passengers leaned back into their seats. Meals were served, lights dimmed once more. But in the minds of everyone aboard, something had shifted. People wouldn't forget what they saw, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was true. as the landing gear extended and the plane began its descent into Istanbul. Julian looked out the window, past the clouds, past the lights below, and whispered to himself, just loud enough to feel it. Don't let them decide your worth. Show them who you are. Because at the end of the day, that was the real lesson. Dignity isn't granted. It's carried, quietly, daily, and sometimes, when the world pushes you to the back, you rise, not by shouting, but by standing, by leading, and by making sure the next person in your seat never has to fight for it again. If this story meant something to you, like, subscribe, and share it. Have you ever been judged before they knew who you were? Drop it in the comments. We're listening. See you next time.